the world's most populous country that wants to have its global say. So what the BRICS really represent is the call for multipolarity as opposed to a US-led world. Europe somehow just wanted to duck under the blanket, and have the U.S. protection, which is very surprising to me because Europe has been very naive in recent years, especially regarding Ukraine. It's accepted huge economic costs without any strategic thinking because the U.S. said so, and we'll see how that evolves.
Seen from the West, Western Europe, or probably even the United States, the BRICS seems to be nowadays something as the black box. There's minimum of contact between the Western academic sphere and BRICS universities, minimum contact between the Ministry of Finance, central banks, etc. You've mentioned the Goldman Sachs, probably even JP Morgan and the others. Can you see some attempts of infiltration of these old Bretton Woods organizations, old banks, houses, as they wanted to infiltrate the BRICS institutions, the BRICS academic circles, because BRICS now really wants to be the number one. Yeah, so I can't imagine that Goldman Sachs wouldn't try to be in close, deep touch on this process.
Well, look, the Wall Street very much has a presence and wants an even bigger presence in China. It wants a presence in India and so on. Russia is another matter because stupidly for the moment, all economic connections were lost and cut, which is a shame. I believe they'll come back because you can't just close your eyes and say that a country of 11 time zones and a nuclear superpower doesn't exist, but that's the attitude right now. In fact, there's lots of connection. Where the breakdown is occurring is at the political level. The companies would like to have ongoing normal relations with China, but the United States is saying, no, we have to go into a containment mode. We're going to scrutinize your investments. If a U.S. company invests in China, it's considered unpatriotic or maybe threatening U.S. security. This is the change, really. And there's lots of interchange over the last 30 years between U.S. and Chinese scholars and lots of Chinese students studying in the United States and Europe, but the U.S. is cutting that too. All of this is bad for the U.S. and Europe. All of this fear, protectionism, hostility is an own goal. It's a self-imposed cost, but it comes from this U.S. idea that either we're number one or we're going to fight to stop you from being so powerful, and it's leading to a very tense breakdown of relations that existed and that still exist to an important extent, but are now under a very dark cloud. And so if you have good relations with China, the eyebrows are raised in the United States. What are you doing? Something improper, and so on. And Europe is increasingly playing with this, which is ridiculous because Europe and China are partners in Eurasia. Europe and China have every reason to cooperate with each other, to trade with each other. The Silk routes are not an imaginary idea. They go back 2,000 years, east-west trade. And but Europe is parroting, or at least Brussels is parroting the U.S. line right now. And the U.S. idea of NATO expanding to East Asia, I have to put as the number one dumbest idea that I've heard. For NATO to open an office in Tokyo, for example. What are we possibly thinking? And how could Europe, which is filled with such intelligent people, ever go along with this idea? I don't know.
Probably the last question. There's a wide discussion about the Brics currency unit, new currency unit, artificial currency unit. Is there something that the Brics as the integration can get inspired by Europe, by special drawing rights? Probably how to avoid the mistakes and the deep errors of them. What should be the design of such unit?
I doubt that there will be a Brics currency anytime soon, but what I do believe is that there will be a non-dollar, non-euro settlements system that the Brics countries will use. Maybe they'll settle a lot in renminbi, maybe they'll settle in Indian rupees, they will settle some in rubles, they may establish financial institutions with extensive swap lines between the central banks, kind of a quasi-IMF that would help to ensure liquidity among the trading partners within the Brics and a broader network. But a single currency, I doubt it. One could say, by the way, that there could be something like a Brics SDR, which is a unit of account, it's a basket, it can serve certain purposes, but it's not really a settlements currency, and it's not really an active transactions currency. So one could imagine something like that, but I don't think we're going to see an actual currency that you can look at or hold in your account that's and use for transactions that's a Brics currency anytime soon. Maybe I'm out of date and it's going to happen faster, but I think it'll be much more likely that, excuse me, on our phones we'll be able to settle in renminbi, or we'll be able to settle in rupees or reales, rather than a single Brics currency. One single moment or one single episode, because it was not a threat to the Soviet Union or to Russia. It was a neutral country. It's a very instructive and almost completely forgotten episode in history. And it's an episode that deserves a tremendously deeper understanding, not only for Austria, but for what might have been in the world. Because one of the reasons that the Soviet Union made that step was that it wanted to set an example. The message in 1955 was, if a country becomes neutral, we leave. And the aim of the Soviet Union in 1955 was to try to convince the United States to have Germany be a neutral country. This is very interesting because, of course, Nazi Germany had caused more than 20 million deaths in the Soviet Union. And at the end of 1945, the Soviet Union, which had been more destroyed and had suffered more than any other country in the total deaths, demanded demilitarization of Germany. The United States said no. Starting in the late 1940s, the US started to arm Germany. And by 1951, the US zone of occupation, together with the British and French zone of occupation, had become the Federal Republic of Germany and had been incorporated into the new US military alliance, into NATO. And the Russians, the Soviets, were very concerned about this, because this was a remilitarization of a country that just a few years earlier had invaded and caused more than 20 million deaths. And the Soviet Union was saying to the United States, we need a peace treaty. We need an agreement. We need to stop the remilitarization of Germany. And the US was saying, no, we are NATO. We're against you. We will defend against you. And after Stalin's death and Khrushchev coming to power in 1955, the Soviet Union tried again. And the Austrian state declared its neutrality, and the Soviet army went home. And the message was, neutralize Germany and we can end the threat to us and we can find a new peace arrangement in Europe. The United States completely rejected the idea, said we will not have a neutral Germany, we'll have a militarized Germany. Our leading diplomat and historian in 1955, our greatest Russia expert, George Kennan, argued vigorously, let us have a neutral Germany. This way we'll have peace. This way we can end the confrontation with the Soviet Union. He was the author, no less, of the containment policy. But he said, I don't mean containment to be a new Cold War or hot war. I mean it to be a prudent policy. We should neutralize Germany. And in 1957, he gave the BBC Wreath lectures calling for this, but he wasn't listened to. So we had a Cold War and an arms race and no peace, and nearly blew up the world in 1962, 61 years ago, because of a nuclear confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the roots of that, if you look deeply, actually involve Berlin and Germany. If you look deeply at the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was about the same issue. This is almost completely not understood, except by our finest historians. But it's not the way we tell the story at all. So the US gave up the chance for peace. Miraculously, the world survived. Then arose a very wise and peaceful and peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was truly a great man, an incredibly decent person. I had the privilege to be on his economic advisory team for 1 year, trying to help mobilize Western support for a collapsing Soviet economy. I failed completely in that because the US, again, was uninterested in doing anything, even to help a peace-seeking leader of the Soviet Union. And as you know, Mr. Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, unilaterally disbanded the Warsaw Pact military alliance in 1990. And at that moment, the leaders of the United States and Germany promised Gorbachev, we will not take advantage of that by expanding NATO even 1 inch eastward in response to your action. Of course, Gorbachev fell the next year, in part because of the financial crisis that the Soviet Union was facing, that the United States refused to help. And as soon as the Soviet Union ended, the strategists in the Pentagon and the White House and the CIA immediately began to plan the expansion of NATO. And so again, the US turned down peace. It could not take yes for an answer. I happen to be rather deeply inside the process in the Soviet then Russian side, because after Mr. Gorbachev fell from power, President Yeltsin asked me to help advise Russia. I said, surely, Mr. President, the United States will understand now to give financial help. Maybe it could not understand with the Soviet Union, but surely with an independent Russia now. And again, the United States absolutely said we're not helping at all. And so just as these two leaders were saying, we want peace, we want normalcy, we want the end of conflict, the United States began planning the unipolar world. Quite literally planning step by step. Even leaders in the Pentagon told one of the generals that I know rather well, Wesley Clark, that now the United States will launch several wars to overthrow Russian allied governments because we now know that Russia can do nothing in response. This is what Clark was told in the early 1990s. And the list included Iraq with Saddam Hussein, Syria with Assad, Libya with Muammar Gaddafi. And those are the wars that came. Those were planned wars. And the NATO enlargement was planned starting in 1992, but really planned in detail by 1997. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, the strategist and advisor to President Carter, wrote an article in 1997 explaining the timeline of NATO enlargement to Ukraine to be between 2005 and 2010. Of course, the Russian leadership said, no, don't do that. That's our red line. Don't cross it. The United States said, we don't hear you. You don't have any say in this. It's literally NATO doctrine, literally. It's enshrined in NATO doctrine that no country outside of NATO has any say in where NATO will enlarge, even if NATO is enlarging to a 2,000-kilometer border of the country. So the United States said, we will enlarge to Ukraine, and Russia, you have no say in it whatsoever. In 2007, President Putin said, don't do this. Do not do this. We're very concerned. We do not want you on our border. The United States. The United States ignored that, and in 2008 committed to NATO enlargement. This is why we have the war in Ukraine. The unrelenting pursuit of power and not listening to anybody else, to any prudent warnings at all. Interestingly, in 2008, the US ambassador to Russia wrote a secret cable back to Washington. That ambassador was William Burns. He's now the CIA director. His secret memo got leaked by WikiLeaks, so we got to read it. Because other than leaks, we don't read anything of what the US government really thinks. Everything is secret. And the media are not storm media. they are USG media. So we read literally nothing but what the US government wants us to read. But this memo was made public by Assange. And the title of the memo is Niet means Niet. And the content of the memo was, it is not just a matter of President Putin, it is every member of the leadership of Russia that opposes NATO enlargement. Pro-Putin, anti-Putin, doesn't matter. All Russian political class does not want NATO on Russia's border. And by the way, I don't blame them for one moment. Who would want NATO on your border? Not I. But it was ignored again. Kennan was ignored, Burns was ignored, Jack Matlock, our US ambassador to the Soviet Union, was ignored. William Perry, our Secretary of Defense, was ignored. The ones that were listened to were Raytheon. They have military establishments in every congressional district. It's jobs, it's money. They pay for all the think tanks on the East Coast. It's big business. Biden has been part of that for more than 30 years. But basically every president is by the time they get there. And so the US could not listen to a red line. And then I won't go through all of the rest of the history because this is not our main topic, but it really is our main topic. In 2014, the US helped to overthrow the last Ukrainian government that just wanted calm, because President Viktor Yanukovych wanted neutrality. He's being pulled by the US on one side, he's being pulled by Russia on the other side. He's trying to keep calm. So he gets the Rada, the Ukrainian parliament, to vote for neutrality. Smart man. Then Europe is saying, you must sign our agreement with us now, now, now. And President Putin's saying, no, don't sign. You will divert trade. We are your major trading partner. We have to be part of this trade agreement. And Europe is saying, Russia, you have nothing to do with this. And Russia's saying, yes, but you are making a trade agreement. We already have a trade agreement with Ukraine. We're party to this. No, no, you have nothing to do with this. Because this is a game. This is not honesty. This is not grown-up behavior. And so a protest started when Yanukovych delayed signing the agreement with the European Union. And the US stoked the protest behind the scenes, pouring huge amounts of money into the protest, funding it. I know it. I saw it with my own eyes, by the way. Leading American NGOs working side by side with the government, pouring in vast money for that protest. Not saying we don't want to interfere, directly leading the protest. And then a violent overthrow of the government, and the new government came in and said, we want NATO. And then the United States said, we'll make you safe. We'll give you lots of armaments. You'll be perfectly safe. And so the US started a mass sale of arms to Ukraine, guaranteed to destroy the country. Absolutely. Clear as could be. They did it. They absolutely destroyed the country. Because at the end of 2021, President Putin made one last try, stop NATO enlargement. And on December 17th, 2021, he put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement. And he had some very important correct points. And I'm not a Putin apologist. I am an objective observer over the last 30 years. President Putin observed the following. First, stop NATO enlargement to our border. Second, the U.S. had walked away from the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally in 2002, and it had basically ended. It started to place Aegis missiles in Poland and Romania. And Putin said, we don't even know what is in those silos, but it's a few minutes from Moscow. This is intolerable. You unilaterally left a treaty. Now we are vulnerable. The United States said, we don't negotiate with you. And in January 2022, the U.S. gave a formal reply to Putin. And the formal reply is, NATO enlargement is none of your business. Literally, that is U.S. policy. It's none of your business. Not that we will sit down and discuss, negotiate, try to understand your security concerns. It's none of your business. I actually called the White House on December 30th, 2021, and spoke to one of the top officials, not to the president, and begged them, negotiate, avoid a war. No, no, Jeffrey, we don't have to negotiate. It's not really about NATO, I was told. I said, if it's not about NATO, say that NATO won't enlarge. No, no, we can't do that. And on February 21st, 2022, Russia Security Council met. President Putin asked Foreign Minister Lavrov, give a report of the status of your discussions with the Americans. Lavrov responded that we have received a firm reply of no negotiation over NATO. We have tried, Mr. President, but we did not succeed. The U.S. will not engage in negotiations. And 3 days later, the special military operation took place. Since then, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are killed. 10 million have fled the country. The economic collapse is probably more than 50%. Ukraine is losing around 1,000 soldiers every day, killed or seriously wounded right now. This so-called offensive or counteroffensive is a death trap. And the U.S. knows it, but we have a presidential election coming up, so we can't quite say it, because that might be embarrassing for the president. And so Ukraine is told, keep throwing your soldiers 1,000 a day to their death or to their permanent disability. And they keep doing it. That's why we don't have sustainable development. Because we're not even trying. How many times has President Biden said sustainable development goals? I literally do not know one occasion where he has used the phrase. Can you imagine? I don't know of one occasion. One of my closest associates over the last 40 years, who was a senior U.S. official for a while, told me that it is U.S. Treasury policy not to use the phrase sustainable development goals, because they're afraid that some Republicans in Congress will object that it's going to put America on the hook with all those poor people. And America doesn't want to hear that. And to give you a real status of the world right now, every country is supposed to have a sustainable development goal plan. And they're supposed to present it to their peers at the UN high-level political forum. And each year, 30 to 40 countries present their plans to the delegates. There are 193 UN member states, and 188 of them have made their plans known to the others. These are called voluntary national reviews, VNRs. 5 countries, only 5 in the whole UN have not made sustainable development goal plans. They are South Sudan, which has been in nonstop war, Haiti, which is in complete disaster, Yemen, which has been in nonstop war, Myanmar, which has been in nonstop conflict, and one more, the United States of America. Those are the 5. This is why we don't have sustainable development. As an economist, I've taken a particular view of this issue over the last 30 years as I came to understand it, starting in the early 1990s. And that is that for some of the things that poor people need, their governments simply cannot afford to provide them out of their own resources. So we need a world that has compassion, that provides some of the things that the poorest of the poor cannot provide on their own. And so starting around 30 years ago, I have been advocating basically nonstop that there should be more financial flows from the rich to the poor so that children in poor countries can go to school, so that they can be immunized, so that they can have a dose of anti-malarial medicine if they have a bout of malaria, and so on. And a lot of what I've done for 30 years is basic arithmetic. Thank goodness for Excel spreadsheets. I have multiplied the number of poor people by the cost of interventions, and I have shown that that amount is very small, but it's larger than the budget of the government of the impoverished country. So I have said, here is a gap, and we should fill the gap. It's not ingenious work. It's so simple that it should be absolutely the most basic exercise that any institution involved in sustainable development makes. Now, I want to explain 2 interesting facts about these calculations, beyond the fact that they show that a country like Niger, which just had a coup a couple of days ago, could never afford to have all its kids in school, given the impoverishment that it finds itself in right now. Maybe in 30 years it could, but right now it needs help. But here are 2 interesting facts. One is the IMF never uses such a calculation to decide how to address Niger or another low-income country in its actual budget programming. In other words, when the finance minister of Niger comes and the income in that country is a few $100s per person per year, and half the kids are not in school, and only 10% of the population has access to electricity, and so on, the finance minister comes to the IMF, and the IMF says, well, you have this much money, so learn to live with it, or die with it. Oh, you would like to have electricity? That's a privilege. Don't expect it. And that's literally, well, they don't say it that way. They just say, be careful, be prudent, don't spend more than you have. Not, we will help you to find the financing. So that's one part of the story. The other part of the story is interesting for right now. In the last 2 years, I've been advising the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and the Deputy Secretary General, Amina Mohammed of the United Nations, on what is the size of this financing gap and how could it be mobilized. And one basic part of the answer is the official banks that we established decades ago, like the African Development Bank, or the Inter-American Development Bank, or the Asian Development Bank, need to be operating at a much larger scale because you have the needs and you have the current scale of operation, so the scale should be increased. And on that basis, Secretary General Guterres called for what we called an SDG stimulus, a financial stimulus to help close the gap of what is needed to be spent versus what is available for spending. Very straightforward. And it would involve the rich countries as a group putting in something like $100 billion a year. For the United States, $20 billion a year, for example. Now, we're a $25 trillion economy. So $20 billion is rounding error. It's not even noticeable. $250 billion is 1% of GDP. $25 billion is 0.1 of 1% of GDP. So this is 0.08 of 1% of GDP. You know what the United States just said last week? It said, we don't think it's timely to increase the capital of the multilateral development banks. Translation. The President of the United States does not want to say a word about this because maybe Congress would object and say you're wasting US taxpayer money on poor people. Maybe the rich would have to pay a little bit more in tax, but that's impossible because the rich finance the whole political system. And so the US says it's not timely. For who? For the people who don't have enough to eat today? For the child who's not in school today? Who's it not timely for? It's not timely for the American plutocracy. That's all. So I don't really know whether economics is needed in any of this anymore. We need Buddhism. We need compassion. We need Ren. We need benevolence. I've come to believe that the Sustainable Development Goals are as simple as the ABCs: Aristotle, Buddha, and Confucius. Aristotle, by the way, who's my favorite philosopher because I know him well, he is at the core of the glorious side of the Western philosophical tradition, had the basic idea of human beings, that human beings are a mix of animal instincts and higher rationality. And it is our purpose, our end, to think and to behave properly as rational human beings, including decently in our social order, in our political order. The Buddha, of course, and I'm here to learn from you, taught compassion as the basis of escaping the cycle of suffering. And Confucius taught virtue and cultivating virtue. And he taught that all people are brothers within the four C's, that this is one humanity and one world. If we abide by the ABCs, we will achieve sustainable development. Thank you very much. Well, this is an absolutely astounding day, a historic day. South Africa has filed an application with the International Court of Justice. This is the UN's global court in The Hague in the Netherlands, and it addresses disputes between governments. In this case, this is a dispute brought by South Africa, claiming that Israel is undertaking genocidal actions and with genocidal intent. And the legal basis for this complaint, this application to the International Court of Justice, is that both South Africa and Israel are parties to the 1948 Genocide Convention. And so this is a complaint that South Africa is making, that it is entitled to make as a signatory to the Genocide Convention, which compels all of the signatory countries, including Israel, to abide by the terms of the Genocide Convention. It's stunning, amazing to watch these proceedings. South Africa filed an extremely detailed application, 84 pages, describing both the intentionality of Israel in destroying Gaza, in making Gaza uninhabitable, and the actions of Israel in bombing core infrastructure, in blocking the inflows of water, food, medicine, fuel that are basic necessities of life. And the combination of the statements by Israeli leaders, from the prime minister and president through the cabinet to members of the Knesset to leaders of the Israel Defense Forces, is a shocking list of statements, because these are statements saying flat out that Gaza is to be destroyed, is to be made uninhabitable, that there is no distinction between Hamas and the civilians, that everybody is guilty. And no doubt these Israeli leaders would like to walk back what they said, because what they said was flat out unbelievably ugly and destructive, and I think South Africa makes a compelling case expressive of genocidal intent. So to watch this in a body of law rather than in the spin of, say, a White House briefing or somebody just brushing this aside, as John Kirby did when he said, well, this is a bunch of nonsense. The United States rejects all of this as nonsense, or the president of Israel saying this is a blood libel. But to hear it spelled out methodically, hour after hour in precise judicial proceedings, is, I think, a historic day, because Israel is being examined closely for what it has said and what it is doing. And this is, to my mind, the highest responsibility and application of the concept of international law. So I think it's a very big day.
The law is very clear, and so our listeners know why you dwelt extensively on intent and why the document itself quotes at length statements from Prime Minister Netanyahu and from many, many people in the Israeli government who pull the levers of power, and the things they said were utterly repellent. You seem to have paused for a second trying to find an adjective horrific enough to describe what they said, but things like burn them alive, bury them alive, they're subhuman. How do you characterize that? What kind of a mind can justify that kind of slaughter of innocents? But to my point, the law requires that the applicant here, South Africa, show not only that genocide took place, but that it wasn't an accident, that it was intentional. And when you can use, I can tell you this from my prior life on the bench, when you can use the words of your adversary to prove your case, that is the most compelling way to prove your case. Let's watch just a minute or so of the initial opening argument this morning. You may have seen this already, Professor Sachs. This is cut 13, Jeff, the opening statement.
The violence and the destruction in Palestine and Israel did not begin on the 7th of October 2023. The Palestinians have experienced systematic oppression and violence for the last 76 years. On 6 October 2023, and every day since October the 7th, 2023. In the Gaza Strip, at least since 2004, Israel continues to exercise control over the airspace, territorial waters, land crossing, water, electricity, and civilian infrastructure, as well as over key government functions. No armed attack on a state territory, no matter how serious, even an attack involving atrocity crimes, can provide any justification for or defense to breaches to the convention, whether as a matter of law or morality. Israel's response to the 7th of October 2023 attack has crossed this line and
last clip, just for those unfamiliar with this kind of a court proceeding, the very end of the clip, you saw all 15 judges, 2 judges added to the panel, one from Israel, one from South Africa. The other 13 are permanent. It's interesting. I thought of you, Professor Sachs, when I saw the name of the person was added. And I saw the last name Barak, and I thought, oh my God, this is the former prime minister and former general, but it's not. It's the former chief justice of the Israeli Supreme Court, a opponent of Prime Minister Netanyahu, whom the Israeli government designated. He's 87 years old, but he's the grand old man, if you will, of Israel law and judiciary, universally respected, and they designated him. I want you to see one more argument before you weigh in, and this is the argument of another lawyer for South Africa who shows a video, and I want you to be able to assess the significance of the video that he shows. Chris?
On 7 December 2023, Israeli soldiers proved that they understood the Prime Minister's message to remember what the Amalek has done to you as genocidal. They were recorded by journalists dancing and singing. We know our motto, there are no uninvolved, that they obey one commandment, to wipe off the seed of Amalek. The Prime Minister's invocation of Amalek is being used by soldiers to justify the killing of civilians, including children. These are the soldiers repeating the inciting words of their Prime Minister.
All right, let's start at the end. What is the significance of Israeli soldiers in Gaza dancing and chanting? We come to address Amalek.
Well, there is a very important subtext to all of this, which is the use of biblical symbology and biblical and religious beliefs that are part of Israel's rhetoric and core to Israel's politics. Amalek is a part of the Bible when the Israelites are instructed by God to kill all of this nation. And it is one of many genocides, in fact, in the Old Testament. The book of Joshua, which is the part of the Bible, the sixth book of the Old Testament, in which the Israelites, after having escaped from Egypt, in the Exodus from Egypt, arrive at their promised land and are instructed by God, according to the book of Joshua, to not only take the land, but to kill every man, woman, and child in the land that they are to take. And it's very clear repeatedly from one nation to the next in the book of Joshua that this is to be a genocide, that no one shall survive. Now, fast forward 2,600 years, and these texts are being referred to explicitly by the prime minister, by the Israel Defense Forces, and by a large part of the Israeli politics, much of which reflects a religious zealotry that takes the Bible as the literal basis for action. And the Bible has in these texts the instructions for genocide, for killing everybody. And we hear this echo not only in the video that the South African lawyer showed, but in a shocking compilation of videos that Gray Zone produced. Max Blumenthal, the investigative reporter, produced, released, and posted on Gray Zone a compilation that is filled one after another with this biblical reference, this genocidal fever, and the chanting and delight at the destruction of everybody. So what we're seeing here is a mix of military brutality, religious zealotry, political manipulation in a concoction that is extraordinary. I think it is so foreign to our eyes to see this, but in the court, to have it laid out so explicitly, and the court is a place of decorum. You saw the lawyer, how dignified and eloquent he was. I listened to much of his presentation earlier in the day, and the room was silent, listening, having to absorb this direct evidence, not having the ever-present and, for me, utterly disgusting spin from the White House newsroom or some other spin, but actually listening to the realities, grim realities, laid out one by one. That's why I think this was a historic day.
Here's what the White House actually had to say about it. This is, I think you've seen this, and I know you won't be happy, and neither am I, but we have to expose this stuff. Here's Admiral Kirby expressing the White House's opinion on this is 3 or 4 days ago, so this is before the oral argument, on the application, the 84-page complaint filed by South Africa.
South Africa's filed this 84-page lawsuit against Israel, accusing them of genocide. Israel says that this is blood libel. Does Washington agree? And where does this put Washington and Pretoria in terms of relations?
We find this submission meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact whatsoever.
I guess he didn't read it if he finds it meritless, counterproductive, and completely without any basis in fact. And I guess Washington is the only country in the world willing to make a statement as outrageous as that.
You know, I find him insufferable day by day.
I do know that.
Yes, you know, I don't exactly hide it, because I just wish there were grown-ups in power, grown-ups who were responsible, who were honest, who were decent, who would read an 84-page detailed complaint and give a serious answer rather than a one-sentence smack off like that. I wish at the same time that the White House press corps would follow up more seriously. Actually, if I remember correctly, that question started with a few words, just a quick one.
Right.
And then the question was asked, and Kirby responded in this utterly disgusting way when the most important issue on the planet is in front of him, and couldn't do more than one dismissive, phony, and false statement. But then there's no follow-up. Then they move on to the next topic and the next topic.
I sometimes think those questions are staged, Jeff, and it's terrible. It's terrible for the American public, and it's demeaning to the profession of journalism.
Yes, how could the journalist say, Mr. Kirby, it's 84 detailed pages, and you say there's no factual basis? Why don't we look at page 10? Why don't we look at page 12? Why don't the journalists do their job? Rather than feeding us the propaganda from the White House, they should be questioning the propaganda. That's why I was grateful for today's court proceedings, because there were hours to put forward the evidence. There is a detailed legal complaint. There are dozens of countries that have supported this, but the US government is all spin, all propaganda, and all attempt at narrative control. And Judge Napolitano, that's why you're doing such a service, because you're bringing these issues to the public attention and to the world attention. But the press that's in that room doesn't even follow up with another question.
Right. Your criticism of the press is right on. I want to mention something. You mentioned Max Blumenthal, who's my friend and who regularly appears on the show. Yesterday on the show, he challenged Bobby Kennedy to a debate on Israel, and I offered to moderate the debate. Now that's out there. Chris tells me it was tossed about in Twitter or X, whatever they call themselves now, last night. So I hope that comes to pass. I would imagine the audience would be huge. It would be difficult for me to be perfectly neutral because I can see with my own eyes what's happening. But if I am privileged to moderate that debate, I will be neutral. What defense should we expect tomorrow? Today is all opening arguments from the lawyers from South Africa. Tomorrow, the Israeli lawyers, who, by the way, are British barristers, take over. What conceivable defense could there be? What mentality of humanity justifies the slaughter of 26,000 people, at most 3,000 of whom were soldiers?
Well, they're going to say that this is in self-defense, that a terrible terrorist attack occurred on October 7, which is true. But as the South African prosecutor said today, that is no defense under the Genocide Convention. They're going to say that these statements are aimed at Hamas, their military enemy, not at the civilian population. That is plainly false, because the statements are explicit about all of the population. They're going to say that they take exquisite care in protecting the civilians, which is utterly false, because they have put a siege on Gaza, stopped the food, the water, the fuel, the medical supplies. They are going to say that they are careful in their targeting of Hamas, which is plainly false, because 70% of those killed are women and children, and many of the men killed are absolutely not Hamas soldiers. So Israel is going to have a defense of self-defense, but they're going to deny what is plainly in front of the world's eyes, which are genocidal statements that are pervasive and rampant, and actions against the entire civilian population, not at all targeted, at a massive loss of life that is overwhelmingly civilian, and the displacement of 2 million people, where Hamas has perhaps 30,000 fighters. So Israel is going to make a defense of self-defense that is itself not defensible, because the plain facts are contrary to what Israel has been saying every day since this invasion into Gaza began.
Do you have a finger on the pulse of how American Jews view the genocide? I mean, I understand Joe Biden is caught in a vice. He's caught between the donor class, the AIPAC folks, and younger people that are traditionally Democrats, but who are horrified by the genocide. So question one is, should the United States be a co-defendant? And then if we come back to the U.S., you know, you live and work at Columbia University, large Jewish American population in Manhattan. Do you have a finger on the pulse about how they feel? Answer either question in which either order you wish, any order you wish.
I think it's quite clear from the opinion surveys that the broad American public is aghast at what's happening, because they're watching, like all of us, day by day, a slaughter of civilians. I think it's clear that there is a generational gradient, as you pointed out, where young people are absolutely defending the Gazan civilian population, whereas older people are tending more towards backing Israel, because that is the way that it has been for decades. But even so, even among older respondents to the opinion surveys, there is a tremendous unease. And in the Jewish community, of course, it's very divided. It's divided by age, it's divided by class, it's divided by interest group, it's divided by different parts of American Jewry, from Reform to Orthodox. But even within Orthodox Jewry, the most religious, there are parts of Orthodox Jewry, notably the Satmar community in Brooklyn, New York, which says that the whole concept of Israel and Zionism was misconceived, because in their view it was religiously misconceived. And of course, other Orthodox Jews take a different view. So it's a lot of division. What we don't have is any overwhelming groundswell of support for Israel in this. Quite the contrary. The American people, every time they're asked and have an opportunity to speak, say ceasefire now. Right. Americans do not want to be complicit in this massacre and in this genocide, as South Africa is describing it today in the International Court of Justice.
Should the U.S. be a co-defendant, Professor Sachs?
Well, the U.S. is going to be a co-defendant in the court of public opinion, because the overwhelming understanding of the world is that Israel could not do this from one day to the next without the United States active support. And it is active support in one absolutely key way, which is providing the bombs, the munitions, the artillery, the shells that are killing people and that are destroying the habitability and the infrastructure and that have displaced nearly the entire population. And so the Americans wring their hands. Blinken says we have to take more care of civilians and so forth, but then signs an order that subverts congressional oversight to directly deliver the munitions to Israel, no strings attached, no conditions whatsoever, so that this continues. So America is complicit, and a subtext of this is that America is on trial as well, because America is Israel's sole backer in the military campaign that is underway in Gaza. Well, it's like the United States. What is democracy right now? It's a game of narratives and propaganda. So I think it's a shame. It's very sad what's happening right now. And the result is war in Ukraine, in which tens of thousands of people are being killed, actually every month now. And this is going on because the U.S. security state insists on it, and we know that just about every politician in Western Europe feels that you can't cross the United States because European security depends on it. There's been almost a complete elimination of the line between the European Union, which is a political and economic construction, and NATO. And it's not an accident that the headquarters of both NATO and the EU are in Brussels. I think it's a sad fact that Europe lost its way by confusing this military alliance, which is a US-led construction, with the political, cultural, social, and economic grouping of Europe, which is an aim to get the best of more than 2,000 years of culture in Europe. But now they're all confused. And I know that the European leaders simply will not cross the White House. Truly, I don't understand why, because none of this is in Europe's real interest. And many European leaders know better. But they're not talking. And what's happening in the media in Slovakia is happening all over the regions dominated by the U.S. And people are afraid. People are afraid of the United States government. People are afraid of the security state. People say, well, that's where our bread is buttered, or that's where our incomes come from, or that is where our security comes from, so we're not going to cross that.
And
but it's terrible, because if people would understand recent history, what is this U.S. security state? It's the one that brought 20 years of destruction to Afghanistan. It's the one that brought the Iraq War. It's the one that destabilized Syria. It's the one that destabilized Libya. And it's the one that destabilized Ukraine, by the way. So people should see it with their own eyes. It's too bad. I want my country to do better, but I would have expected other countries to look at the facts as they are.
How do you think the conflict in Ukraine is developing, and how will it end?
Well, I think Ukraine is getting destroyed. I said at the beginning of this that the United States was going to turn Ukraine into Europe's Afghanistan. What did I mean by that? The United States went into Afghanistan in 1979. President Carter ordered the CIA to start funding the jihadists to try to overthrow the Afghan government. That was 44 years ago. And look at the result. The U.S. turned Afghanistan into a 40-year battlefield. And then one day it just left, because that's also the U.S. way. Same happened in Vietnam and in many other places. The whole thing with the U.S. is plenty of weapons, but as long as the U.S. isn't fighting there, they're content to keep sending weapons and keep having bloodshed. What's sad is that the Ukrainians are, for some reason, party to this. The Ukrainian leadership, we don't know what the Ukrainian people feel because it's martial law, there's no elections, there's no asking. Now Zelensky said mobilization of every male in the society. Are they really going to just continue to throw away the lives of tens or hundreds of thousands of people for NATO enlargement? I don't know.
The American think tank Rand Corporation released a report on the post-war reconstruction of Ukraine. The United States and several Western European companies want to participate very actively in the restoration of Ukraine. You worked in Ukraine in the 1990s. You were an advisor during several transformations in Eastern European economies. How do you think is it possible to prevent this recovery from ending with the sale of Ukrainian companies?
No one is going to rescue Ukraine, believe me. There's going to be no Marshall Plan for Ukraine. There's going to be no hundreds of billions of dollars for Ukraine. This is all fantasy world, period.
And my last question, Mr. Professor, what is your explanation for the fact overall the sanctions did not put the Russian economy on hold? The war and sanctions are growing by less than 2%. According to the World Bank, Russia's economy is now the strongest in Europe and the fifth largest in the world. How is it possible?
Because most of the world does not agree with the U.S. and European Union. Shockingly, the Americans and the Europeans don't understand this because our media don't tell the truth. But my job is to work all over the world, mainly in the developing countries, in Africa, in Latin America, in South Asia, in East Asia, in Central Asia. Nobody believes in the official story that this is unprovoked Russian aggression against Ukraine. Everybody knows this is about the U.S. and Russia, NATO enlargement, U.S. power. This is what people know. So governments around the world didn't stop doing business with Russia. That's it. If they had, the sanctions would have had a much bigger effect. But Russia's actively trading all over Asia, all over Latin America, all over Africa. And the sanctions regime is just the US, EU, UK, Japan, Korea, Singapore. That's it. And the rest of the world is doing its business. And our media can't understand this because their job is to report the U.S. government narrative, which is that the whole world is united against Russia. Well, nonsense. This is exactly why these sanctions didn't work. By the way, the sanctions didn't work for a simple reason, which is not only does most of the world want to continue to have normal economic relations with Russia, but it's not so hard to have arrangements that don't involve U.S. banks. You just use other people's banks. That's the story. And so settling in rubles or settling in renminbi or settling in some other currency is not rocket science. It's just if you're not a friend of the United States, keep your money out of U.S. dollars because they may take the money away. That's the lesson. And so Russia's now dealing in non-dollar transactions.
For last 3 years, you are being consulted because of the COVID, because of the Ukraine war, etc. But predominantly, you are an economist. Yes, so we would like to take advantage of your economist knowledge. And you quite often mention that there's the de-dollarization threat, that it's clear that the de-dollarization will happen. So the question is, especially in the terms of huge United States inner debt, what will be the causes of de-dollarization for the United States? And what are the causes of de-dollarization for the Western economics, which are closely joined, which really depend on the United States economy?
I think there are two different issues for people to understand. One is the so-called real economy, what different parts of the world produce, the technologies that they have, the trade in goods and services, the innovations. And the second is the financial side, how transactions are made, in which currency, in which institutions, banks, or through the internet, and so forth. And the point that I'm making broadly is that on the second dimension, the role of the dollar will diminish over time for two main reasons. One is that it's not safe for any country that is not in good foreign relations with the United States to keep its reserves in dollars, because the U.S. has basically militarized the dollar. If you're an enemy of the United States, the U.S. will confiscate your foreign exchange reserves in Venezuela, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in Russia. So the United States didn't say, oh, we protect the property rights, we may have disagreements, but we protect the property. Quite the contrary. The United States said, we're freezing all of Russia's financial assets. And not just that, quite interestingly, if you're a friend of Putin, whatever that means, I don't know what that means in a court of law, but we're going to take your apartments, we'll take your financial assets, we'll freeze your bank accounts. It's really amazing to me because the United States is supposed to be the place that protects property rights. So the first thing is that lots of governments, especially the governments not friendly with the United States, are trying to find a different way to settle transactions, and they're smart to do so. The second thing that's happening is that the normal way in general of settling transactions, which is through banks, is going to diminish because of digital currencies, because of the ability to have central bank digital currencies. I think this will make a big difference. It's only at the beginning, so it's a little bit hard to say the timing, but I do believe that there will be direct settlements using basically central bank direct settlement mechanisms rather than going through commercial banks, which is much more laborious. But we went through banks for hundreds of years because that was the only alternative. Now with the internet and with all of the paraphernalia around digital finance, we can do it in a much more efficient way.
Well, if the demilitarization of dollar happened under different administrative, under different president, do you think that that dollarization can slow down, the dollar can remain the bad first-class currency for other tens or hundreds of years?
Not for hundreds of years, certainly, but there is normally a very gradual change in settlements processes because of network externalities, so-called, which means people use dollars because other people use dollars. So the dollar has a certain staying power. The U.S. is wrecking it by its foreign policy right now. It's shocking to me how they're taking measures that are directly wounding the role of the dollar, because I wouldn't have done at all what the U.S. government has done in freezing assets and seizing assets and so forth. But still, the dollar remains because there's a lot of infrastructure. There is the big network. There is a lot of financial expertise. But the U.S. is also, over time, declining as a share of the world economy. The sterling, the pound sterling was the dollar of the 19th century. It was unthinkable that there would be anything other than the pound sterling. Now, what's the pound sterling? It's a footnote in history. It's still used in Britain, but who cares? It plays basically no role in the international system. And someday that will be the situation with the US dollar, because the US is only 4% of the world population. So it can't really be the center of the world the way that American strategists want it to be and believe it to be. But the dollar could remain for quite a while, not on our current policy though.
Well, let's discuss the BRIC, because BRIC, and it's nearly forgotten right now, was created as the toy, as the mental toy of Western academics. First of all, it used to be just an acronym in 2001. But now it's emancipated, it's strong, it seems to be the new economic integration, and there are some discussions about the enlargement of that. So first of all, do you think that Western academics really intend to create this very self-confidence integration? And secondly, do you think that it can be really enlarged unless it was harmed by the enlargement?
Originally, the BRICS was the idea that, boy, there's a lot of good places to invest in a diversified portfolio because you have these emerging economies and they're growing, they're adopting technologies. So it was a Goldman Sachs invention, not a Jeffrey Sachs invention, but the bank Goldman Sachs. It was basically a reflection of the emergence of the emerging markets. But then it became political.